We're going to get started with this next lecture in the series on diversity in U.S. legal history. Obviously, Professor Klarman needs no introduction, so I'm not going to give him one. And I was going to spend a little time referring to his just published book, The Framers' Coup, but you have flyers about it. The issue of race actually does play a significant part in the book's analysis of the framing of the U.S. Constitution. Before I turn this over to him, just want to remind you that the next lecture in the series is this Wednesday by Professor Diana Eck of the Divinity School and other locations in the university, very distinguished scholar of religious pluralism around the world. And then we have a one-week break, and then the following week there's a lecture by Catherine Franke of Columbia Law School, the topic of which I think is something like the case for reparations, but it hasn't completely come into focus, but in my mind. So I'll just turn it over to Professor Klarman.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm honored to be invited to give a talk in the series. When I got the invitation, I thought I might talk to you about a book I've been thinking about writing, mulling over writing for about the last 10 or 15 years, which is a book on race in American history as told through the lens of baseball and other sports. But I know not everybody shares my general enthusiasm for baseball or my particular passion for the Red Sox, so I'm not going to subject you to that. I'm going to talk instead about a book I wrote about a decade ago for Oxford University Press, which has a series on inalienable rights, and I wrote the volume on racial equality in American history. So there are 8 discrete points that I'm going to make today, 8 observations about race in American history. With each one, I'm going to offer an historical example or two. You could call the talk, if you're looking for a title, 8 things that Mike Klarman thought he learned about race in American history while working on a previous book. I think this will probably take about 30 or 35 minutes, and then I hope that'll leave us. We have to stop at 12:50, so I hope it'll leave us a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to stick around in the hallway for 15 or 20 minutes afterwards. I have something else at 1:15, but if people have questions they don't have a chance to ask, and you want to come up, we can continue it in the hallway. Okay, so one qualification or limitation on what I'm going to talk about. The book is about white-black relations. For most of American history, that was the dominant racial paradigm. It's gotten a lot more complicated in the last 50 years with the change in the immigration laws in the mid-1960s, but it was always more complicated than that because of issues involving Native Americans or Chinese and Japanese on the West Coast. But this book is mostly about black-white relations. I obviously don't mean to deny the importance of the history of other racial minorities, but that's not really my area of expertise, and that's not what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so the first point is racial progress in American history has not been ineluctable or inevitable. I think the conventional narrative that most people imbibe from high school history or whatever is that it's been a story of almost inevitable progress. First, during the Colonial Era, you had slavery both in the North and in the South. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but the population of New York, for example, was about 15% enslaved in the middle of the 18th century. Then the North abolished slavery either during or after the Revolutionary War. Slavery had been abolished in the last of the northern states, at least in a prospective sense. They tended to abolish slavery for people who were born after the date of the legislation was passed when they reached a certain age. So these northern emancipation laws didn't actually free anyone then living. But the last of the northern states had abolished slavery in this forward-looking way by 1804. Then, of course, the South abolished slavery as a result of the Civil War. The South replaced slavery with this institution known as Jim Crow, or formalized system of white supremacy. That system was gradually weakened through the course of the first half of the 20th century, then ultimately abolished, according to this conventional narrative, through some combination of Brown versus Board of Education and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I want to suggest to you that's a misleading narrative. There have been lots of times in American history when racial attitudes and practices regressed rather than progressed. I'm just going to give you one quick example. During Reconstruction, between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the end of Reconstruction in 1877, during that period, Southern blacks could vote. They often turned out at a rate of 90% of adult African-American males turning out to vote. They elected large numbers of office holders, congressmen, state legislators, a Supreme Court justice in South Carolina. Blacks served on juries. And there were also a fair number of anti-discrimination protections written into law, both at the federal and state level. 30 years later, around 1900, by way of contrast, Southern blacks had been almost universally disenfranchised, notwithstanding the 15th Amendment that says you can't disfranchise based on race. Southern blacks had been excluded from office. There were no Southern blacks serving in Congress from 1901 until 1972. Blacks were excluded from jury service. There was a dramatic increase in the number of lynchings in the late 1880s, early 1890s. Southern blacks were clearly better off as a matter of law in 1870 than they were in 1900. So again, my first point is there's nothing ineluctable about racial progress in American history. It's a story of fits and starts, progress and regression. Second point, racial progress, to the extent it's been made in American history, is not really a result of Caucasians, whites, seeing the light and doing the right thing. The conventional view, I think, is that we have this American creed of racial equality. It's stated in the Declaration of Independence. American history is often portrayed as a gradual movement, a gradual adjustment of racial practices in the direction of this creed of equality as people come to see the light. They understand that America has not lived up to its commitment to the idea that all people are created equal. I think that view is largely untrue. I think African Americans have had to fight for all the racial progress that's been made, and I think progress, in addition, has always required that conditions be ripe. So those are actually my second and third points in turn. First, that African Americans have to fight for all the change that's occurred, and in addition, that change has only occurred when conditions were ripe. So with regard to blacks fighting for the racial progress that has occurred, I give you two historical examples. When Franklin Roosevelt issued his executive order during World War II, which created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which barred race discrimination in defense contracting, he did so largely because the famous black labor leader A. Philip Randolph was threatening to bring 100,000 African American protesters to Washington, D.C. in order to protest racial segregation in the United States military. Roosevelt didn't create the Fair Employment Practices Commission simply because he thought it was the right thing to do. If he thought it was the right thing to do, he could have done it in the first 8 years of his presidency. He did it because the nation was on the verge of entering World War II, and he thought it would be a very destructive thing for national unity if 100,000 angry demonstrating African Americans showed up in the nation's capital to protest segregation in the military. Second example, when President Kennedy proposed landmark civil rights legislation in 1963, it was almost entirely a product of the street demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama that spring, not because Kennedy suddenly saw the light on civil rights. The Kennedy administration had adamantly resisted pressure during its first 2 years in office to introduce civil rights legislation, despite much African American criticism. It was Birmingham and the scenes of police dogs and fire hoses, which was communicated through this new national medium of television, brutality against peaceful demonstrators, often children, that stirred the nation's conscience and led the administration to do the right thing and propose a landmark civil rights bill. Third point, which I've already alluded to, African Americans demanding their rights generally is not sufficient to produce racial change. Conditions also have had to have been ripe. Now, there are a variety of long-term, deep-seated factors that have been conducive over time to racial progress. This is not meant to be exhaustive. I'm just going to note a couple of those, and I'll note a short-term factor as well. First of all, educational progress has been critical. Educational progress in the black community, probably the white community as well, was probably necessary before you were going to get a successful movement for civil rights. Most African Americans were illiterate immediately after the Civil War, largely because it had been a crime to teach slaves to read and write, and 90% or more of African Americans in the United States were enslaved when the Civil War began. It's very difficult to organize a social protest movement among an illiterate people. It's much easier to organize educated groups. Also, people, bless you, people who are educated tend to have higher aspirations. They can imagine race relations other than those that already exist. And in addition, as African Americans made educational gains, it became tougher to rationalize denying them the right to vote because they couldn't pass literacy tests, or excluding them from professional schools. For example, there are essentially no Southern black law schools before World War II, but as blacks became better educated, it became harder to justify those exclusions. Another critically important long-term factor in progressive racial change was the so-called Great Migration. About 5 million African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North between 1910 and 1960. Now, in the North, blacks could vote largely without racial restriction, and they could therefore exercise political power. African Americans were mainly drawn to the North by better jobs. Better jobs opened up initially because of wartime demand, labor demand during World War I. Economic power, in turn, translated into greater social and political power. There were better schools in the North, which enabled African Americans to get a better education. There were looser mores, racial mores in the North, which enabled the formation of protest organizations like the NAACP, which really couldn't exist, literally couldn't exist in most of the South when it was founded in 1909 because of the risk of physical violence against blacks who challenged the racial status quo. All right, I want to just take a really quick detour and make a general observation about the point I was alluding to. It would have been almost impossible to reform the system of Southern white supremacy entirely from within. African Americans in the South could not vote. They were almost universally disenfranchised by 1900, 1910. They commanded few economic resources. They weren't allowed to become too well educated, meaning, for example, it was very difficult to become a lawyer, and without lawyers serving the black community, you can't challenge the racial status quo in court. And as I've already suggested, maybe most importantly, blacks in the South had little protection from physical violence until after World War II. External pressure is critical to change a system like that. This meant ultimately having a black population in the North where Northern blacks could try to influence the views of Northern whites and in turn influence the national government to do something about the Southern system of white supremacy. That's how to understand, for example, the push by the NAACP for a federal anti-lynching bill in the 1920s and 1930s. They're trying to influence white congressmen from constituencies with large numbers of African Americans to introduce national legislation that will mostly benefit Southern blacks. Another important long-term factor conducive to progressive racial change was the factor of urbanization. Not only did African Americans, beginning around World War I, start to move from the South to the North, within the South they moved from rural areas to cities, which translated, for example, into better schools. Black schools were always better funded. They were still unequally funded, but it wasn't as extreme as the disparities in the rural South. This also meant better economic opportunities for blacks. Black entrepreneurs and professionals could take advantage of the segregated economy in southern cities and achieve middle-class status as black doctors, black dentists, black undertakers, serving black communities. African Americans also found greater physical security in cities. Lynchings were almost always a largely rural phenomenon, and it's very difficult to demand one's constitutional rights when doing so might get one killed. Also, it's easier to organize social protest in cities than in rural areas simply because there's better transportation and communication. Now, those are long-term factors. I also want to emphasize one important short-term factor that's been conducive to racial progress throughout much of American history. Somewhat ironically, that's war. War has often been incredibly important to promoting progressive racial change. The Revolutionary War essentially killed off slavery in the North, and it produced a temporary disruption of the slavery system in the South, although ultimately slavery regained momentum and became even more secure. The Civil War, of course, ended slavery, and it also translated quickly after the war into post-war constitutional amendments guaranteeing African Americans a certain measure of civil and political equality. World War II, it turns out, and I think some of you know this, but probably not everybody, World War II was a watershed in the history of American race relations. The ideology of the war, of course, was anti-fascist, yet the United States was fighting a war against an enemy that was committed to Aryan supremacy and doing it with a segregated army. That seeming paradox forced many Americans to rethink their racial views. In addition, 1 million blacks wore their nation's uniform during World War II. They were off risking their lives and in many cases sacrificing their lives for democracy. But when they got back home, if they happened to be from Alabama or Mississippi, they weren't allowed to vote. That struck them, naturally enough, as incongruous. Many of them became the vanguard of the post-war civil rights movement. Finally, World War II led directly to the Cold War, which created its own imperative for progressive racial change. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a life-or-death struggle, or so it seemed at the time, for the allegiance of developing nations, most of which are predominantly non-white. And the Soviets' principal propaganda points focused on American race relations, segregation, and episodic racial atrocities, such as the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in the summer of 1955. This created a strong impulse for progressive racial change, simply to counteract Soviet racial propaganda. These forces I've been describing that were created or accelerated by World War II led to dramatic changes in racial practices soon after the war. So Jackie Robinson desegregated Major League Baseball in 1947. Harry Truman desegregated the military and the Federal Civil Service by executive order in the summer of 1948. There was a four-fold increase in black voter registration in the South in the 1940s. Now, that was from a fairly minimalist baseline, so you're talking about an expansion of maybe 5% to 20%, but it was still pretty dramatic within a decade. And even in the South, with police forces, juries, public accommodations, sometimes becoming desegregated by about 1950. Even in the Deep South, cities like Birmingham and Montgomery, they were desegregating their minor league baseball teams. You get the baseball theme. That's pretty much the only thing I ever think about, especially this time of year. Moving on to the fourth point, and the Red Sox were the worst. I take responsibility for that. The Red Sox were the last team to desegregate, not until 1959. That is not a fact that Red Sox Nation is proud of. Fourth, racial progress in the United States has often been an unintended consequence of actions that were undertaken for other reasons. For example, most white Northerners did not undertake to fight the Civil War in order to defeat slavery. They did so in order to preserve the Union. In the first year of the war, Congress actually passed some resolutions defining the nation's war objectives, and Congress clearly stated that the point of the war was to preserve the Union, not to attack slavery. If the Confederates had been willing to lay down their arms in the first year of the war, they almost certainly would have been able to return to the Union with their slaves. What changed was the war didn't go very well for Union forces in the first year. African Americans were obviously an important source of labor that was growing the cotton, that was financing the war for the Confederacy. If emancipated, you could subtract those former slaves from the South's labor pool. And in addition, if Northern opinion could bear it, you could give the African Americans rifles, put them in the Union Army, and make them additions to the North's military advantage as well as subtractions from the South's labor force. So Lincoln decided eventually to emancipate the slaves, but it's important to note how incredibly controversial that decision was. Many Northerners were not willing to fight a war to end slavery as opposed to a war to preserve the Union. There were draft riots throughout much of the North after the Emancipation Proclamation, and in addition, Republicans lost 36 congressional seats in the fall 1862 elections, just a month or two after Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. So to repeat the point and emphasize it, the abolition of slavery and the expansion of black civil and political rights after the war were an unintended consequence, largely, of a war that for most people was initially undertaken to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. Not for everyone. There were abolitionists who always wanted the war to be about slavery, but they were a distinct minority. Second illustration of the point, I've already mentioned African Americans migrated from the South to the North, beginning roughly with World War I. There was obviously some migration before, but it increased exponentially in the 19-teens. They did that largely for economic reasons. Labor shortages opened up during the war, both because many people had been conscripted into the military out of the labor force, and because submarine warfare shut down immigration during the war, and immigration in many years before the war had been as large as 1 million people a year. For the first time in American history, decent industrial jobs in Chicago meatpacking, Detroit automaking, Pittsburgh steel plants opened up to African Americans. Now, that migration was primarily, not exclusively, undertaken for those economic reasons, but it had obviously unintended social and political consequences, as I've already described. Blacks in the North could vote. They immediately began exercising some political power at the state and local level, and by the 1940s, also at the national level. In addition, as I've mentioned, blacks in the North enjoyed greater security from physical violence. That meant they could form protest organizations like the NAACP. These results were largely unintended consequences of a mass migration that was undertaken primarily for economic reasons. Fifth point. Whites have often had ulterior motives for the racially progressive policies that they did undertake in American history. For example, Northern free soilers in the 1840s and 1850s wanted to keep slavery out of federal territories mainly because they were white supremacists. They didn't want black people in the territories, not because they were worried about the welfare of slaves. Yet ultimately, that struggle to keep slavery out of federal territories is what led to the creation of the Republican Party in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. When that party elected a president for the first time in 1860, obviously Abraham Lincoln, that led Southern whites immediately to decide to secede from the Union, which led to the Civil War, which ultimately became a war to emancipate the slaves. Second example of racially progressive actions taken for ulterior motives, and here I'm simply repeating a point I made before. After World War II ended, the Cold War began. With it came this strong imperative for progressive racial change that I've already mentioned. The State Department, which was not known as a particular bastion of racial equality, was quoted in the Justice Department's brief in Brown versus Board of Education as saying to the justices, you simply have to abolish segregation for these Cold War propaganda reasons. That was doing the right thing, but it was doing the right thing for what you might consider an ulterior, or at least a non-racially progressive motive. It was fixing domestic race relations in order to enhance the United States position in the Cold War battle against the Soviet Union. Okay, sixth point. I've just got two more after this one. Throughout American history, there's been a particular dynamic to racial change, which I think is not widely understood. And I don't mean to suggest it's an inevitable dynamic, but it's hard to miss that it occurred both in the 1850s and again in the 1950s, and both times it produced significant racial progress. The North and South start out with racial regimes that are different, but not always dramatically different, sometimes just slightly different. Northern states did put slavery on the road to extinction after the Revolutionary War, but the North was certainly no racial paradise. In the South, slavery became more deeply rooted after the Revolutionary War. Southern slave owners began to resent the idea that they were not good enough to take their institutions with them into federal territories. When Northerners started to try to keep slavery out of federal territories, an enterprise that escalated with the Mexican War in the 1840s, when the United States acquired a significant additional territory from Mexico, Southerners began to demand access to those territories, and they even demanded access to territories that had previously been off limits to slavery. That's Kansas and Nebraska, which there was a statute passed in 1854, one of the most critical statutes in American history. That statute is what led to the Republican Party. It allowed slavery back into the Kansas and Nebraska territories. Northerners strongly resisted such demands. That's how the Republican Party was formed. It formed in the North in response to the Kansas and Nebraska Act, and its platform was keep slavery from expanding into federal territories. Northern politicians would sometimes try to frighten Northern voters into supporting the Republican Party with an image of a relentless, grasping Southern slave power. Most Northerners didn't care very much about the welfare of slaves in the South. They cared a lot about the idea of the South's slave power infringing on their own liberties. For example, forcing them to compete with cheap slave labor in Western territories, or requiring Northerners against their will to be conscripted into fugitive slave posses that would capture and return slaves who turned up in the North to their Southern owners. As Northerners became more resistant to continually compromising with the South over slavery, white Southerners became even more fearful for the survival of slavery, and in turn they began to raise even more exaggerated demands. For example, by 1860, Southern whites were demanding that the federal government write a slave code for federal territories. Those extreme demands alienated Northerners even more. They elected to vote for a Republican president in 1860, which for the Deep South was sufficient cause for secession. That same dynamic, Southern whites demonstrating almost a kind of paranoia over threats to their racial institutions, threats that really hadn't developed very far, and the Southern paranoia leading to exaggerated demands, leading to Northern resistance, and Northerners increasingly thinking maybe the national government should do something about Southern racial institutions. That same dynamic was at work 100 years later in the context of Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. From the end of Reconstruction through roughly World War II, the South had this system of institutionalized formal white supremacy. The North was no racial paradise. African Americans were excluded from white neighborhoods. They were excluded from lots of occupations. They were often de facto segregated in schools. The North was no racial paradise, but it did not have a formalized system of white supremacy. Southerners after World War II started to grow increasingly fearful that the national government was going to intervene against Southern racial institutions, and Brown versus Board of Education made that threat very concrete. The Southern white response was generally to mobilize extraordinary resistance to desegregation. Racial extremism crept into and it came to dominate Southern politics. Violence erupted in places like Birmingham and Selma, Alabama, where, as I've said, it was televised to national audiences. Most Northern whites were appalled by that violence, which they now saw lay at the core of white supremacy, and they demanded federal intervention to suppress the system. So that's the dynamic. Southern paranoia leading to exaggerated demands, pushing Northerners away. Southerners grow even more fearful. They demand more. Northerners start to say, well, this is ridiculous. We're going to demand federal intervention. And Southerners end up bringing about inadvertently the demise of slavery, which certainly wouldn't have ended in 1865 had it not been for Southern secession, and ending the system of Jim Crow, which also would not have ended in the 1960s had it not been for the exaggerated Southern resistance to Brown. All right, so all these changes, I'm moving on now to the last 2 points, all the changes I've described so far as a result of World War II, the desegregation of baseball, the desegregation of the Federal Civil Service, and so forth. Notice those occurred before the Supreme Court decided Brown in 1954. My next two points have to do with the role of the Supreme Court in achieving racial progress in American history. The court has not reliably been on the right side, meaning what we would today regard as the right side of racial equality. Before the Civil War, the Supreme Court routinely sided with the interests of slaveholders, not the interests of slaves. For example, the court upheld the Federal Fugitive Slave Act against what should have been seen at the time as substantial constitutional objections, and the court invalidated northern state efforts to protect even their own free black citizens from being kidnapped and wrongfully taken to the South and enslaved. In the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, the Supreme Court both said that the federal government did not have the constitutional power to exclude slavery from federal territories, and that black people, even if born free, had no rights which whites were bound to respect. After the Civil War, the court reversed on what I think can only be seen as legal technicalities, the criminal convictions of whites who had participated in lynchings or mass racial massacres of African Americans, and the court during that era also invalidated the last piece of civil rights legislation passed until the 1950s. In the early 20th century, the Supreme Court regularly upheld segregation and various measures for disenfranchising blacks. Over the last 45 years, since roughly the end of the Warren Court in 1969, more often than not, the justices have struck down race-based affirmative action. They've struck down measures designed to secure a certain measure of African American political representation, and they even struck down the voluntary use by local school boards of taking race into account in order to promote racial integration. Those decisions are regarded by most constitutional historians as extraordinary perversions of the original understanding of the 14th Amendment, which makes them somewhat ironic because they are handed down by justices who generally subscribe to a jurisprudence of original understanding. Really, it was only for the half century from about World War I through 1970 that the court reliably sided with the interests of African Americans and civil rights. But, and that leads me to my last point, even those rulings that have been favorable to civil rights were generally supported by national public opinion. So, for example, when the Supreme Court in 1944 in Smith versus Allwright struck down the white primary, those were Southern mechanisms for excluding blacks from the only elections that mattered in the one-party South, the Democratic Party primary. When the court did that, contemporaneous opinion polls showed that as many as 70% of Americans favored federal intervention against Southern electoral devices for disfranchising blacks. Similarly, and maybe more surprisingly to many of you, when the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education in May 1954, opinion polls showed that half the country agreed with the decision. Slightly more than half, not a lot more than half. So even when the court has favored the interests of racial minorities, it's usually been reflecting rather than shaping dominant public opinion. So, to be fair, I should note that the court's more regressive racial decisions also generally reflected dominant opinion at the time. If I'm not going to give the court a lot of credit for its progressive rulings, it seems only fair that I shouldn't give it a lot of blame for its regressive decisions. They both generally reflected popular opinion at the time. So, for example, when the court in 1857 said that even free blacks had no rights that whites were bound to respect, that decision was pretty certainly reflecting dominant opinion in the United States. In 1857, blacks could only vote in 5 New England states, and with a racial restriction in New York that didn't apply to whites. Those 5 New England states were about 6% of the black population in the North. That's not the right way to say that. African Americans in those 5 states, no, that's not going to get me there either. Of the black population in the North, only 6% lived in New England, and of the black population in the nation, only 10% lived in the North. So you're talking about 6% of that 10%, being enfranchised at that time in the United States. Everywhere, north as well as south, blacks were either excluded from public education or segregated, Massachusetts being the sole exception. In several northern states, Indiana, Illinois, Oregon, Iowa, they actually had state constitutional provisions barring blacks from even migrating into the state. So I think this aspect of Dred Scott, that even free blacks are not citizens, clearly was something that a majority of the country would have supported. In 1896, when the court decided Plessy versus Ferguson, which of course was a ruling that state-mandated racial segregation does not violate the 14th Amendment, it was again certainly reflecting dominant white opinion in the country. Even the Republican Party at that time, the party of Lincoln and the party of Emancipation, by the 1890s had largely given up on the project of defending the rights of Southern blacks. National newspapers barely noticed the Plessy decision, much less criticizing it. Remember, this was an era when the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, could make a statement, as he did in 1905, that, quote, race purity must be maintained. That's what most white Americans thought at the turn of the century. So the lesson to take away from these last 2 points is that the Supreme Court is much more a mirror of society than it is a shaper of social mores. That's not to say the court doesn't play any role in influencing opinion. It's simply to say the court plays a marginal role. The justices could not have foisted regressive racial rulings on a nation that did not support them. And if we don't like the racial jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, we probably ought to be looking to blame ourselves as much as the justices. Now, just to end on what I think most of you would consider a happier note, I certainly would, it would only take one more presidential election, and I've heard rumors that we're about to have one in about 5 weeks. It would only take one more election for Democrats to control the Supreme Court for the first time in 45 years. If that were to happen, that would, I think, undoubtedly improve the racial jurisprudence coming from the Supreme Court, because the justices are divided 5-4 on most race issues, just like they're divided 5-4 on everything else. All right, so I did leave almost 10 minutes for questions. I hope people will have some. Thank you.
Thank you. Hundreds of years ago, African Americans and other minorities were prevented from getting good jobs and also voting because of education. Today, it's very similar. Many African Americans and other minorities attend failing schools and also attend university less than than whites. Do you think there's a relation between that fact and the idea of keeping African Americans and other minorities disadvantaged?
So, I mean, you asked a great question, which is probably a question everybody else has on their mind. I mean, how much has changed in the last 50 years and how much hasn't changed? And it's an incredibly complicated story, right? The United States has a black president. Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King would have thought that was probably inconceivable for another century or two. It happened much quicker than they could have anticipated. 2 of the last 3 or 4 secretaries of state have been African American. There's an African American on the Supreme Court. There are lots of African Americans who've achieved middle class, upper class status. It's a story of 2 different societies. For urban blacks who are in cities like Chicago, there's extraordinary violence still. The murder rate is way up this year, not across the country, as Mr. Trump would tell us, but in some cities like Chicago and Baltimore, blacks, racial minorities generally tend to attend worse schools. They have lower life expectancies. The wealth they control is 1/10 or 1/15 of that of whites. All of those are a legacy of a history of discrimination, segregation, and slavery, and something obviously ought to be done about it. But we shouldn't miss the fact, we shouldn't just be pessimistic. I mean, it's not great that 50 years after the civil rights movement, you can still tell this story of 2 different societies. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that there have been lots of change as well. Now, if you're going to ask me what should we do to make additional change, you know, I'm not a politician. I'm not a public policy analyst. I don't know. I'm a little bit depressed that after 8 years of an African American president, we still have this extraordinary sort of racial tension, animosity. You know, it is a fact of life that in Mississippi and Alabama, fewer than 10% of white people voted for President Obama. You could try to tell yourself a story that that's not about race. race, but that, of course, would be willful blindness. Of course, that has to do with race. Incarceration rates, even for crimes that are committed equally by blacks and whites. Blacks are 7 times as likely to go to jail for marijuana possession as whites. Both members of both races smoke marijuana at roughly the same rate. So there are a lot of things that we haven't made a lot of progress with. I think we have to identify and agree that there's a problem before we can solve the problem, and half the country doesn't think there is a problem. So that's going to be really difficult.
A couple of things. One, during Lincoln and Emancipation period, him, very similar to Francis Scott Key, who wrote the national anthem, who was the district attorney of D.C., their mindset was, I'd rather see blacks sent back to Africa than see them in this country as free black people. That being said, when the emancipation was presented, how were they able to have it reach into private slavery and private plantations? I'm really curious how they maneuvered that.
Right, it's a massive confiscation of property from the perspective of slave owners and people who sympathized with them. So 2 things. First, it is important to note, Lincoln is a great president, Lincoln is a great man, but Lincoln, when he was running for political positions in Illinois, which was a state where there was a referendum on whether to retain the exclusion of blacks from the state in the Constitution, and it passed by over 100,000 votes in 1862. When Lincoln is running against Stephen Douglas for the Senate in 1858, Lincoln, when he's in southern Illinois, which is populated by white Southerners who have lots of sympathy for slavery and are terrible racists, he always says things like, the fact that I don't want a black woman for a slave doesn't mean I want her for my wife. I don't think black people should vote. And I think you have to acknowledge racial prejudice, whether you agree with it or not. And my view is blacks and whites will never live together peacefully and successfully in this country. Lincoln supported colonization well into the war. He had black leaders at the White House in the summer of 1862 and told them the patriotic thing to do would have been to be willing to colonize yourself to help solve the race problem. But on the other hand, Frederick Douglass said he never met a man in his life who he thought had as little racial prejudice as Lincoln, and he did become the great emancipator, and the Union did enroll blacks in the military, and Lincoln supported at least a measure of black suffrage. So that's the point about Lincoln. On emancipation, you could only do this during wartime. During peacetime, first of all, the national government couldn't touch slavery in the states. That was agreed to by most people across the political spectrum, except for a fringe of abolitionists. So the national government couldn't do it, and you obviously couldn't do it without compensating slave owners, because there's no takings under the Fifth Amendment without compensation. The only argument is, during the war, you can do this as a war measure. There are lots of things you can do during the war that you couldn't do during peacetime. You can blow up somebody's farm, you can confiscate their horses, and so the argument was, as a war measure, we are undermining the Confederacy by confiscating slave property. They actually passed statutes. But whether those were constitutional or not would depend on which judge resolved the case. And Democrats thought this was outrageously unconstitutional. Democrats thought Lincoln was a dictator. They thought emancipation was outrageously unconstitutional. They thought it was unconstitutional for Lincoln to suspend habeas. They thought it was unconstitutional for the federal government to conscript people into the military. I mean, that's how Democratic newspapers ran. Lincoln's a dictator. Right? Same things that a lot of Democrats would warn about today. You elect Trump, you're going to get a dictator. Well, that's what Democrats thought about Lincoln. That's what Republicans said about FDR in the 1930s.
Thank you. To what extent do you think that the decolonizing wave that swept through Africa proper in the 50s and 60s influenced the civil rights movements of the same era?
I think it had a big effect. I think, there's a famous quotation, I think, from James Baldwin around the time saying that black nations in Africa are decolonizing and we can't get a lousy cup of coffee. So segregation in public accommodations, how do you justify that in this era? You look at countries in Africa that are decolonizing one after the other, beginning in the mid to late 1950s through the 1960s. I think that was incredibly inspirational to Southern blacks. I don't think it's the only thing that's going on, but I think it's a significant factor. Yeah. We have time for another one or two? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the speech and thank you for the discussion. I'm wondering, when it comes to external pressure, we talked about how external pressure has influenced Congress, how it influenced the presidency, but how can you influence the judicial branch with external pressure when most judges are appointed, they have lifelong sentences, things of that nature?
Yeah, so a lot of my teaching and scholarship is emphasizing the point that justices on the Supreme Court tend to reflect public opinion at the time. So even though they do have lifetime tenure, even though they're not subject to immediate political pressure, just by virtue of being alive at the same historical moment and by virtue of being part of the same culture, they're likely to feel the same forces that society feels. When the Justice Department files a brief in Brown, front and center is a quotation from the State Department saying to the justices, you need to strike down segregation as a measure of national security. Now, this is the peak of McCarthyism. This is the height of the Cold War. The Supreme Court through the 1950s has dozens, really hundreds of cases, a couple hundred cases involving national security issues, legislative investigations of alleged communists, criminal prosecutions of communists, teachers and other public officials being fired from their jobs for taking the Fifth Amendment because they won't talk about their past involvement with the Communist Party. You have to see Brown as wrapped up with that. We don't think of Brown as a national security case, but a lot of the justices who are national security conservatives, it's music to their ears when the federal government tells them you need to strike down segregation as a measure to enhance our competition with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So it does affect them, even though you're right, they're life tenured and they're not subject to direct political pressure in the same way.
Okay, well, thank you for a stimulating discussion, and we'll see you on many of you on Wednesday.